The reading is taken from Matthew chapter 9, verse 35 to chapter 10, verse 8. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go, rather, to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick. Raise the dead. Cleanse those who have leprosy. Drive out demons. Freely you have received. Freely give.
The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favour in your eyes, my lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf and gave it to a servant, who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There, in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh."
I would suspect that many of us, when we first went into this season of lockdown back in March, never imagined that here we would be in the middle of June, still in that situation. And I guess that we'll all have our different reasons for perhaps wishing why that was no longer so. But I've got to admit and say that one of mine is that I've realised for a while now that if we're going to stay with the Revised Common Lectionary, which I think has served us well in recent weeks, then we're going to be presented with some Old Testament and Gospel readings in the next few weeks, and indeed in today, that are actually quite challenging stories. But you know, the one thing that they always drummed into me at theological college was don't just trawl through the Bible looking for the easy bits. So yes, I'm going to stick with it. And I want to acknowledge, though, that all the readings that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of weeks or so are going to include some quite challenging narratives. And I've got no idea why or when you might be watching this video, but I want to say to you that we as Christian believers recognise that some parts of our scriptures are difficult, but we believe that God's word is embedded in these narratives. And if I'm honest, I often find that it's when I actually stick with and grapple with those difficult bits that I discover some of its most profound assertions. So please bear with me in this challenge. But yes, this story of Sarah and Abraham is a difficult story. It's a story about a woman who can't have children, a woman who is disappointed and hurt, and who, quite frankly, has not been helped by some of her previous experiences as a consequence of that. And we might not be surprised if that sense of disappointment and hurt comes out when yet again she hears this promise being made that she's going to have a child. And it comes out when she overhears that. And then the story ends with her apparently exposed and humiliated for laughing in what she thought was her own private space. But I think there's actually a lot more to this story than that. And what I want to invite you to notice are the very real human behaviours that we see on display all the way through it. You know, I can remember hearing sermons about this when I was a child, ranting about Sarah's lack of faith, about how displeased God was with her and how we must never show anything like that lack of faith. Well, take a look at the story. Never mind what people have said about the story. Nowhere does it say that anyone was displeased with Sarah. All we're told is that God knew she was laughing, and God asked her why. So what it does say is that she was invited to be honest. And that's how I want to explore this story for a few minutes today. What does this tell us about being honest with God? But before we do that, let's just take a look at some of the technicalities, so to speak. Now, as is true in all of these Old Testament stories, it's set in a culture that is very different to our own. It was written in a culture that is very different to our own, and we've got to kind of make room for that as we read it. And it's also depicting something that happened thousands of years ago, which is why there is a kind of air of mystery to the narrative. And you might therefore be a little bit confused by some of the introduction. First, we're told that the Lord appears. Then we're told that Abraham is confronted by three visitors. And then his response is to address the three visitors back in the singular as Lord. Now, as I've said, this text was written hundreds, if not thousands of years before Jesus was born, and yet I find it interesting that we're looking at it the week after Trinity Sunday, and I want to suggest that some of those apparent confusions actually contain some quite profound truth. Trinity Sunday, the Sunday when we recognise the three persons of God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. And this is a feature that we're going to notice a few times in the Abraham Chronicles. Even though they were written centuries before our understanding of Jesus emerged, they contain traces of some of the key elements of our Christian understanding. And that's why we hold the Bible in such high esteem, because we recognise that it is so much more than just a human account of a series of events and ideas. The writer could not have realised the significance of what was being described at the time. Three in one, God in three persons. And we can see, even in this story, the foundations of our Christian faith being laid. But let's get back to the story and press the pause button, so to speak, and look at what's happening. God visits Abram. This is what we call a theophany, which is just a clever word we've invented for a visitation from God. And God visits Abraham when he's sitting at the entrance to his tent on a hot day in a very ordinary set of circumstances. You know, you may remember last week I talked about the ordinary becoming extraordinary through the presence of a triune God. Well, this is certainly what's happening here. And I hope that even that might encourage us. You know, it struck me as I've looked again at the story of Abraham that he never went to church once. Here he is, a founding figure of 3 world religions, Christianity, Judaism and Islam. And he met God in the most profound of ways, but he met him in his tent. He met him in his fields. He met him in the everyday of life. So do not imagine that somehow being in lockdown, being in our own homes, somehow restricts God's ability to find us or for you to encounter God in profound ways. God can find you anywhere. And at this point too, I also want to bring in our New Testament reading, because this is also a story, as is the New Testament story, about hospitality. In the case of our gospel reading, it's about being commissioned to be proclaimers of God's kingdom. And the way and the place to do that is by allowing others to show us hospitality, to discover God's presence, to experience God's transforming power, not inside a religious building, not even in our own familiar surroundings, but out there in the community full of key workers and protesters and neighbourhood volunteers and friends and colleagues. That is where God is to be found when Jesus sends his followers out on a commission. Jesus sends them out to reclaim what he calls the lost sheep of Israel. And in many respects, this is what's happening in the life of Abraham and Sarah. God has come to help them reclaim his promise. The kingdom is coming, which in the case of Abraham and Sarah means that a child is coming. And in God's kingdom, we need to be open and honest and ready to receive from others. And there's maybe some interesting lessons from Abraham that we can learn through that. You know, as I've said, I think honesty is a useful place from which to begin to explore this passage from the Bible. And one of the areas that I think we need to be honest is not putting the characters that we meet in the Bible on a pedestal. You know, the New Testament writer Paul reminds us that we've all sinned and fallen short of God's glory. That's part and parcel of what it means to be human. And the characters that appear in the Bible are no exception. And I think it does us no harm to recognise their faults, because it reminds us that if God can use imperfect people like them, then he can use imperfect people like you and me. And one thing we have to acknowledge in these Abraham chronicles is that they reveal to us many of his faults. There's a lot of things that Abraham does that I really do not think commend themselves as representing what we're about as God's people today. And I think there's something almost comical in the way that Abraham reacts to what is happening. I mean, he gets it. He recognizes that he is having a theophany, as we say. He is encountering no other than God. On this occasion, he's not just hearing God's voice, he's actually meeting with God. And he doesn't know what to do. And there's something, as I've said, almost comical about the way he behaves. Oh, my Lord, let me get you some water. If I could be so honoured as to let me get you some bread and some meat. And I love the way the visitors respond, because if you look at the narrative, it's well, very well then, if you must. He's going flat out to impress them, and they are so matter of fact about it. And of course, the added comedy for me is that he doesn't actually do half the things that he says he's going to do. He just creates a load of work for other people. Do you notice how all the verbs in this part of the story are all verbs about rushing? He hurried to the tent to give Sarah a job. Quick, make some bread. He rushes to his herd and he does the easy bit by killing one of the flock. And then he leaves his servant to do all the butchering and the preparation. And then he tells the servant to hurry, and the servant has to hurry. And then he heads off to find some cheese or some curds and milk, as the Hebrew puts it. And then he sits down to offer this great feast and to lay it all before them. And the visitors just say to him, "Where's Sarah? We haven't come for you, we've come for Sarah." And this is another place that I just want us to stop and reflect for a minute. Because I can't help but look at this moment and ask myself, is there a picture of me in that? You know, my reaction to God's presence can so easily be to just run around being busy and getting lots of other people to get busy for God too. And God is not actually that interested in his curds and his whey and his foot sanitizers and his fancy cooking. I want to talk to Sarah, says God. I want to talk about Sarah. It's Sarah that I'm interested in. Do you know, it is so much easier to keep ourselves busy for God than it is to really spend time engaging with God. And I wonder whether that's really one of the big challenges that this season of lockdown has presented us with. God is not looking for a church full of activists. He's looking for a church community of prayerful worshippers. And as I read this narrative in Genesis, I get the feeling that God almost has to interrupt this manic catalogue of busyness and to say to Abraham, "Can I just tell you why I'm here?" Now, I don't want to start claiming that God has somehow sent COVID-19 upon us. I don't think that's helpful. And I don't think we should overlook the very real cost of this pandemic for many people and families. But it has also interrupted an awful lot of our busyness, both as churches and as a society. And this is a real opportunity for us to hear what God has to say. And if we are going to engage with God, then perhaps we need to recognize that God is often much more willing to engage with us than people sometimes assume. But of course, on this occasion, what God has to say causes a quite understandable reaction from Sarah. In a year's time, a woman who has lived with the disappointment of childlessness, who now considers herself too old to have children, is going to have a child. And she laughs. And before we rush to condemn Sarah, or indeed to assume that God condemns her, let's just think for a minute about why she laughs. What is represented in that laughter is a lifetime of humiliation and disappointment and conflict. Like I said earlier, it is really important that we don't just put these Bible characters on a pedestal and assume that they can do no wrong. And Abraham has a lot more flaws than just being a manic dinner host. If you take a look back through the preceding chapters, there really are some eye-watering episodes in the life of Abraham. Abram, as he was then known, hears this call of God to leave the security of his home and become this wandering traveller, and then heads off to Egypt to escape a famine. And basically, when he gets to Egypt, he asks Sarah to tell everyone that she's his sister and to basically make herself available to any Egyptian bloke who poses himself as a threat to Abram. And it's pretty clear from what then happens that this is something that God is hardly impressed with. And for that matter, neither is Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And then later in life, because she's childless, Abraham sleeps with one of Sarah's servant women. I know, okay, it was Sarah's idea, but Abraham could have said no. He could have trusted God's promise. And given what happened in Egypt, what pressure might Sarah have been under? Like I said, let's not put these people on a pedestal. So much of God's story is worked out in very ordinary and messy human circumstances, which, like I said, gives me hope that God can even be at work in the messy circumstances of my life. And then, not surprisingly, then comes an ongoing relationship of jealousy and goading as Hagar, the servant woman I talked about, becomes pregnant. And all the fallout of that reality begins to emerge. And for well over a decade, Sarah had lived with all of that. So you can imagine how she felt as once again the conversation comes around to her having a child. So why did Sarah laugh? Because years of pent-up pain and hurt and frustration were released in that moment. But like I said, I sense that a key element at the heart of this story is honesty. Because do you notice, God does not condemn her for laughing. He just asks her why. And we can choose to see that moment as a moment of condemnation or a moment of opportunity. And I suspect that has as much to say about our culture as God's intention. Why did Sarah laugh? God asks a question that arises from God's all-seeing honesty. Why did you laugh? God presents Sarah and Abraham with an opportunity to pour out their hearts, to release their frustration and pain. But Sarah does what human nature so often does in a moment like that. She denies laughing. She cannot cope with God's honesty, and so she misses out on an invitation to release that pain to God by being open and honest back. And this is the third moment in this story that I would just invite you to pause and reflect. How do we respond to God? Do we just run around and get busy and keep other people busy? Or do we have the courage to truly engage with God and be honest? What are we bringing to our encounter with God? We might not have the same backstory as Sarah, but we'll have our own pains and struggles and disappointments. And can we be honest with God? Can we see this moment not as a moment of condemnation, but a moment of opportunity? You see, human nature says, don't be honest, put on a brave face, pretend it's all okay. God says, of course you can be honest, because I already know. I'm not confined by other people's agendas. I'm with you, even when you're hiding yourself away inside the tent and keeping busy with the tasks that other people have devised for you. God says, I can be with you in your current tent of social isolation and lockdown. I can find you. And you don't need to feel that you have to hide anything away from me. And we're going to go on to see that although Sarah did eventually have a child, many of those underlying emotional issues were never quite resolved. And some of the big divisions in our world today, many perceive them as having their roots in this moment. Now, I don't know, but I can't help looking at this story and wondering what opportunities were missed here for Abraham and Sarah, not just to have a child, but to really experience their hurts and their pains being addressed. Now, in all honesty, I don't know, and I may be wrong. But the whole point of reading these stories is to learn from them in our own journey with God. And so, irrespective of what might or might not have happened for Abraham and Sarah, what about you and me? We can be honest with God. We can't hide anything away from God, so let's not pretend that we can. And let's not miss out on the opportunity to acknowledge our struggles and our hurts and our disappointments. And through our honesty and openness, receive all the love and the grace that God has to offer. Sarah laughed because Sarah was human. Sarah laughed because Sarah was hurting. Sarah laughed because Sarah was disappointed. And God asked her why. And in that moment gave him the answer to tell him. And if you're laughing, or you're struggling, or you're feeling angry or hurt or upset, the message of this story for me is that it's okay to be honest with God.